This is going to be a slightly abridged CTA comparison to the last ones because we have to get the other people to go then judge the novices because they have a longer meeting. But with that in mind, and I started to be about like 7. So with that in mind, we'll talk a little bit about case selection.
Oh no.
Go for it.
Is this one recorded?
Yes, as of now. Haha. I start with a quote from Sun Tzu, like all good things. We talk a lot in debating about what to do in the battle, like when you're actually debating, when you're making your argument, how to construct it, how to engage with other arguments, how to give your speech. But to be victorious, you probably have to go in already knowing what you're going to do, already choosing your weapon, and the case is kind of what that weapon is. And as Sun Tzu later says in the same chapter, you can't really guarantee victory by just like having a good case. It's kind of just the first building block to winning. But you can almost always guarantee that you don't lose a debate because of having a good case. If your case is good enough and you run it in a really mediocre way, like I can almost guarantee that you'll probably second, maybe third, and maybe even win that debate. Like, I don't know. I feel like I've made a whole career in debating out of running good cases in a mediocre way. Like, you don't even have to be that good at that point. With that in mind, then, we're going to start from the very beginning, try to illustrate this point. This is round 9 of the second top room at Euros this year in Copenhagen. The motion is this House regrets the decline in Western military interventions following the 2003 Iraq War. Opening government talk about how Western interventions would have been good because they would have meant that conflicts end more quickly, and so therefore the human cost of them doesn't go on for decades and decades like it has. Opening opposition say, well, if you don't have as many military interventions, which are really expensive, then you can probably afford to invest more in important domestic policies, things like Medicare, things like investing in welfare, stuff like that. CG talk about why non-military interventions as the likely comparative are going to hamper globalization and mean that you get retaliation from people who don't like your sanctions. And then closing opposition say, well, without this decline, you would have had a specific issue in Kurdistan, which meant that the consequences in the Middle East would have been even worse because you wouldn't have been pulling out from Kurdistan, but actually just having more boots on the ground intervention in there.
Debate was so different to mine.
This is a kind of whack debate in a lot of ways. A lot of these cases are like kind of interesting. This is also weirdly a lot of high quality teams that are engaging here. Like 3 of them break protected, 3 of them get to the open semifinals of Euros, and 1 of them ends up winning Euros. That's why I haven't labeled them, because maybe you'd be biased by this. The first exercise we're going to do, just to illustrate what the power of having the right case can be, is I want everyone to think about this really carefully and think of the one team that if you were to stake your entire life on it, you're pretty confident didn't lose. You don't know if they like necessarily won or not, but what case here are you like pretty sure that they didn't fourth the debate? When you've had a thought about that, everyone's going to close their eyes and we're going to vote and we're going to see if anyone died. Because I think it's pretty easy, well, I guess time will tell, to figure out when a case is good enough to not fourth, even in really top rooms. Does anyone else need another second?
Yeah.
Basically, you're picking the case that you think is least likely to lose. Okay, how are we feeling? Everyone close their eyes. Mara, your eyes are not closed.
Slower processing speed.
Yeah, I believe that.
You can't just do that to someone.
It's giving single energy. Okay.
I guess if everyone else closes their eyes, Myra doesn't really have to.
Yeah, okay.
But everyone other than Myra closed their eyes.
I can see how we voted.
That's cool.
Yeah, and
sorry, that's like really logical. Literally, that's the whole point of the ballot. Thank you, Helen. Actually, that's wise. Great. Who thinks that OG didn't lose?
Are we supposed to
raise your hand if you think they did not lose?
Wait, like, do we raise our hand?
You raise your hand for exactly one team.
Okay.
You're betting on them. Great. Who thinks OO didn't lose? Who thinks CG didn't lose? Who thinks CO didn't lose? Okay, everyone can open their eyes. It's the morning and the mafia have got them. Interestingly, you guys had no consensus. 3 of the teams got votes as not losing. And the team that actually forced this debate, all of you didn't vote for that one team. So clearly, even just based on these real simplicities, you guys recognize that actually you could pick a winner. I would argue here that kind of 3 of these teams, including myself, I'm OO in this round, run like kind of shaky cases, particularly back half CG and CO.
We run the OG from CG, but then OG kind of ran the CG from
Yeah, I think OO, which is where I was, could have gone really bad if Tom hadn't fixed it right after in the Fiello. But the point is, even CO, who are really, really, really good teams, this is the Copenhagen kids who ended up getting to the semifinals, and CG, who was one of the most popular picks of you guys to a fourth, who ended up winning Euros altogether at Zagreb, still run cases that are just about good enough, even without being great, knowing that these cases often can't win. The idea here is you can spend a lot of time in debating, making sure that the 7-minute speeches you do tick all of the perfect boxes about being proven and I don't know, all that other kind of stuff. And that's good, but actually just having the right case or having more carefully the not wrong case can get you really far to getting points, even in top rooms. Yes, go ahead, ask them.
So what's the correct answer? And also what does beget mean?
I'll answer the second question first. Beget just means like leads to. So that's the consequence of it. Fair enough. It's an unnecessary word. The real answer to this debate is in order of speakers. So OG first, OO second, CG third, CO fourth. And that was roughly what you guys seem to say. More people had OG definitely being safe, then OO, then CG, then CO.
I feel like OG is like kind of easy to exploit. Like that.
Yeah, right? Like OG, I agree. This is not a perfect case. It wasn't a perfect case in the room. It's totally a beatable case, but it's a really hard case to fourth with.
I thought CG was the least like easy to exploit. I don't know, in terms of like an argument.
CG in this round suffer from some sort of comparative problems. Like if non-military interventions are the alternative, sanctions probably lead to retaliation, but probably militarily intervening in a country also leads to retaliation. There are issues like that. But anyway, there's lots more analysis that you can do on a much deeper level. But the point is, on the very surface level, you actually can get a lot anyway. So with that in mind, here is my table of contents. I'm going to spend a lot of time on that first point, basically making sure that the case you pick because I think that's the largest strength of good case selection skills. Picking the case that wins is often an impossible battle because you have cases that could win, but actually making sure that they do usually comes down to what you do in the debate. But selecting a case that at least guarantees you're unlikely to be the team that fourths is, I think, pretty easy. And we obviously do it most of the time, but making it 100% of the time means that you'll be really successful. I think this is like the biggest thing you can do in debating to win more is basically losing less. I'll explain that a little more. I have pictures of Tom here because it's Tom's birthday. Everyone say happy birthday, Tom.
Happy birthday, Tom.
And I don't know, they're kind of cute pictures. He didn't give me permission to use these pictures. Okay.
And wait, they're being posted on the internet.
Yeah, these are all going to be public. Good luck for him getting a job. Great. The case that doesn't lose. You should really stop losing because, first of all, it's just a much easier thing to do than win. Anytime that you fourth a debate, the only thing you needed to do to get one more point was beat the worst team in the room. You need to beat the team that thirded as opposed to the team that first. The point you get marginally from going from a fourth to a third is the exact same point that you get marginally from going to a second to a first. But if you remember any OA that you've ever got, probably the team that first did was like pretty good in a lot of things. And therefore going from a second to a first is kind of hard because you have to make your speeches better than the best team. But when you go from a fourth to a third, you just have to make yourself better than the worst team in the room. So targeting the person and making sure that you can at least get a third is just a much easier and more efficient way to get points without having to do nearly as much. This is like pretty obvious. I'm quite sure you've heard this before, but thinking about it in that way means that going for a risk-averse kind of approach with case selection is often advantageous because it's much easier to secure at least a third than it is to try to go for the first because your like marginal return on that, your marginal benefit for that is much lower. The second thing is that probably all of the other things by doing well in debating are heavily reliant on what other teams do, what they say, how they operate, how good they are. But if you think of finals you've watched, usually you know that a team is out. If you can just make sure that you're not that team, you don't really need to worry too much about what other teams are doing, because as long as you have a case that is in isolation good enough, usually you can at least sneak a third or a second from it. So it's the most controllable aspect as opposed to other parts of debating. And then lastly, I think this is really important. Once you can guarantee you don't fourth, mathematically that means that your average points per round go from 1.5, so somewhere between second and a third. That means that you end the tournament, if it's 5 rounds, on 7.5 points, 7, 8 points, you don't break, to, well, now you're only getting third, seconds, and firsts. Even if you're average after that, you're not any better than anyone else. you're averaging 2 points around now because you're most of the time getting on average a second. And that means that over the course of a 5-round competition, you're likely to end on something like 10 points or 9 points or 11 points. So that marginal half a point difference that you get by just making sure that you're not the team that fourths means that if you change nothing else about debating and your odds don't change otherwise, you end up breaking much more often, which is, I think, just an easy, good way to do it. Basically, get better at debating by being better at debating. Can't be that long. Questions on this slide? Lovely. Proofs in the pudding. I'm not that good at winning debates, but I'm decent at not losing those debates. These are the last 50 debates or so I did until Princeton IB round 5, where I pretty dastardly fourth. But anyway, before that, you can at least do well enough to make sure that you're hitting the thirds when you really do fuck up, or hitting the seconds and firsts when you're doing better. With cases that are going to be in a place to put you there, then it means that basically all these competitions I broke, except for the one that we ended up fourthing in. So Tom and I were really successful about this at Euros because we're good enough at just giving something that's mediocre enough to be passable. And then from there, that can carry you to success a lot of other places. This is a quote that's actually a tenet of insurance. He is assured who does not seek profit, but makes it that he never be in loss. It's much easier to do that than anything else. Any questions on this part? I hope that I've convinced you that this is worthwhile. Why is it then that teams lose in the most part? I would say that these are the 3 broad categories of why you fourth debates. The first is because your case is just terrible and you're also terrible and you have no redeeming qualities. This is like when you run something that isn't proven, or you run a case that actually is the wrong side of the motion, or you run a case that's entirely derivative of your open, any of that kind of thing. The second 45% is your case is maybe okay in some debates, but in the context of the round that actually happened, your case is terrible, and so are you, and you have no redeeming qualities. So that's like in the instance when from CO, you're running a certain extension that's reliant on OG giving a frame they didn't give. Or more often, you're not comparative to other teams that tried to fight on the same impact and you never addressed what they were saying. Or you have a case that you run that is entirely derivative of your opening and can't be credited. An example of this was, actually, I think I can get to this example later on, but really easy is just selecting a case once you have a few in the context of the debate. So you're not OG, you're CG or something like that, and you're just picking the case that's the wrong case for that room. I think if you hear OAs, this is when judges have a really tough time doing the pairwise comparisons because they say, here's the problem with CO's case. CO loses to OG because of the problem in CO's case. CO loses to OO because of the problem in CO's case. And CO loses to CG because of the problem in CO's case. That's often how you end up getting to the fourths. Every now and then, you have an instance like this one down on the bottom. This is Adam and Rodon in Euros 2024, where they killed it and still lost because everyone else was just better. That happens sometimes. I can't really help you with that. Case selection isn't going to be enough to get you there. You're just going to have to get better at debating. But frankly, I haven't done that, and it's worked out fine. With that in mind, the principle that there is no automatic fourth is really helpful for judging and BP debating. And it's for me because you should probably be evaluating things, showing more things happening. But from a speaker perspective, I think it's helpful to think some things are quite likely to condemn you to a fourth, even if not automatically so. If your extension is derivative, it's going to be pretty hard to save. Maybe your whip will help you out, but especially from a first speaker selecting the case kind of perspective, you should notice that sometimes you run a case that just fourths, and so make sure that you avoid doing those things. Okay, that was a lot of explanation about why it's important not to lose. Here are the 2 types of cases that I think lose a lot. Those that are cases that aren't, and those that are cases that are maybe clever and abstract, but really struggle to conform to the rules of BP. This is a quote from Euripides' Medea, more willing than wise, which is just sort of elegant Greek. But basically, it's very easy to run a case for which you are eager, but actually is not particularly wise. And if you took a step back, even without this workshop, and thought, is this case the kind of case that probably sounds like it's going to fourth? I think a lot of times sort of realize that ends up being the case you're running. Okay, on the case being a case, I have 2 subpoints here. First, for clarity. Some people, like Rodon, I'm not going to be very unsubtle about that, want to have lots of things because they have tons and tons and tons of ideas. And so if you can always boil down the cases that you give, particularly an extension, to a single thesis statement that explains this is what the case is going to be about, that puts you in a position where it's much easier for the judge to track. Because the judge is trying to track 4 cases and has been doing that all day. And therefore, if you have a case that is extremely easy to explain with a single sentence, you're going to be in a much better place than if it's actually pulling from 6 different arguments from 6 different places. So it's really easy to have in prep time a bunch of ideas about a motion, arguments and mechanisms that work for that motion. it's really important to make sure that you distill those into a single actual case. In extension, that's usually one. I've never successfully run multiple extensions as much as I've tried. In opening, usually you can run two, but make them really clear. Here is case one, here is case two, here's a thesis statement of the case. This is a good exercise, making sure that you can have a thesis statement for your case, not because you always need to actually present it in the round. You don't always need to say, here is the case I'm going to run, though I think it's helpful to do that so that the judge knows what you're talking about. But also it's a good exercise for you and your partner to make sure that what seems clear to you will actually be clear to the judge. Because when you're selecting a case, you and your partner have discussed that case for the last 15 minutes, so it will always feel more simple and understandable and obvious to you than it will to anyone else in the room. So selecting a case that can be easily distilled for someone else, putting your words in the terminology of how you would explain it to someone with a thesis, is much better than relying on what you did in prep, because you probably distill those ideas more yourself than other people will recognize. That's the second point here on practicing restraint. Good quote from Donna Varga about that too, if you're interested. And then lastly, the extension versus leaders thing. This is what I talked about making sure that on extension, you're labeling, here's the extension. When you're giving an analytical extension, it's also, I think, useful to have in your mind exactly what burden you're extending upon. So if they're running a case about consuming this art form will make consumers feel better, be really clear if you're giving an extension on the burden that you're going to fill in and why that burden is necessary for their case. So select an extension in that case that isn't just, we're going to do this but better, but specifically, here's why the extension that we're selecting is a new thing that is necessary for their case. Because when you operate it like that, then it's simultaneously showing how it beats the opening and how it stands on its own two legs. So you say, they haven't considered why people even consume art in the first place. And without opening up and explaining how people consume art in the first place, it's unclear people would react to art in XYZ ways. We're going to spend a lot of time explaining how this type of art means that people engage with it more. Great. Analytical extension specifically already explains how you get to the OG impacts. So being really clear and selecting for a case that is even more clear than you think it needs to be is really useful, because we have a bias because we understand the things that we're saying to think that those things are universally understandable when they're actually not. Second thing is on relevance. This is a little bit what I was talking about earlier in terms of contextually how you operate, and you pick a case that contextually operates with the cases around you. So at Princeton, we had a motion on this House believed the developing countries should make reducing supply chain and trade relations with the US a key foreign policy goal. This is a policy motion. As OG, we gave a model that was like, you do this by focusing, particularly for developing countries that have overarching trade reliance with the US for lots of reasons. You do it by just like trading less with them and instead trading with other global hegemons, usually China or the EU. There is also a frame for this debate that is more protectionist. So an OG could stand up and say, well, the way that you would reduce supply chain is by being more internally resilient. So having more things focused on individually making sure that your country is providing for itself. I point out those differences because closing opposition prepped a really good case on why this policy will lead to protectionist policies, and then why those protectionist policies are likely to be bad. But because PM has specifically modeled out protectionism as a way to implement this motion, and instead say, here's how this is going to be done, it means the CO case just can't work in the context of the model that PM gave. So thinking of those kind of like other things that are going to affect your case is really important. So when you're thinking of an extension, notice what you need the model of the PM to be, or notice what you need opening opposition to concede in order for your case to work, and then make sure that they say it. Do that actively as opposed to passively, because if you just rely on yourself recognizing when someone says something that ruins your case, you're much more likely to miss it because they say it in a sort of coded language that you understand. Whereas when you make sure that you look for the things that they need to say to actually make your case work. So in this case, saying, here's where protectionism is part of the model, having a flag in that in your head is going to be helpful. Yeah, go for it.
Do you have any advice on what specifically you would do to be adaptable within the context of around it? The frame that is given of a prime minister basically just like torpedoes your case.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Your case in a motion like this shouldn't be dependent on the PM giving a certain type of model or O making a certain concession. You can have a case that's like that. So if I'm CEO in this case, maybe there's a great protectionist case here that I think O is unlikely to get to. Perfect. Have an idea for it, write out a little bit of it, spend 5 minutes on it in prep. And then I'd spend 5 minutes on a different closing opposition case. Like, I don't know, probably OO will run backlash here, but other kind of things. And then when I hear the PM speech and when I hear the LO speech, then I lock into the case. That's usually how I do it with my majors partners in the past, where we'll have 2 labeled extensions from closing, maybe 3, most of the time 2. And based on what the first speaker and the second speaker said, PM and LO, we'll just pick one of those. I'll tell my second speaker what we're saying, and we'll go from there. I think having that backup is important, especially if you want to run a cool, different extension, because you have the security to bail on it if it's bad. The other useful tool here is to ask yourself, was this argument what the CA was thinking? Sometimes there are really creative arguments that end up doing well, even in spite of the CA not thinking about it. But most of the time, the CAs are good debaters. So when they assigned this motion, they did it for a reason. They did like a bunch of depth testing, and they all have like lots of arguments they want to come up with on both sides. So if the argument you're thinking of can easily fit into what the CA depth test probably would have looked like, if you can imagine the CA is thinking, oh, here's an argument that would exist for this side, probably that's a helpful way of getting there. And the way you think about that is, well, is this the kind of thing that reasonably has operated in BP debating before? Which brings me to the next thing on this. Any questions on what I mean when I say make sure that your case is a case and not a case? Lovely. Okay. The next thing is kind of sad, but make sure that the case that you're running on motion actually conforms to how BP debating works. Because for cases to be proven and to work in BP, they need to be provable with respect to the burdens put on them. So the things that the argument says need to be able to be sort of axiomatically linked to the premises that you can prove. So you say, here are the 3 reasons why this thing is true. And if that makes this thing true, then it leads to the next thing, and so on and so forth. Oftentimes, there are good arguments based on this thing might be true, and that might lead to this thing. But when you don't have certainty, you can't really operate in a BP frame. There are 2 examples that I'll give here, but more importantly is this awesome Latin quote. Certain is what is able to be rendered certain. So if something can't physically be rendered certain, in BP debating, you're unlikely to get to the point of saying, well, this is a probabilistic impact that might influence things. Even if your calculus on that is right, even if you can say this will eventually be the consequence that might have an influence this way or that way, if you don't conform to BP debating in proving burdens that then eventually get you to impacts, you're much more likely to fork because it's like considered too speculative of a case is always the comment that's given. Yeah, go for it.
If we're operating, I know we're operating in a debate world, but like you try to emulate the real world as much as possible in your like analysis, because that's just, yeah. So when nothing is certain about how real world impacts will turn out in economic debates or politics debates, whatever, how do you reach that like certainty of here's what my impact's going to be, as opposed to like, yeah, if you're trying to go for something like high burden, low probability, like when I used to like debate back in the US, there would be a lot of like, there's going to be a chance of nuclear war, it's low, but you have to vote us because a chance of nuclear war outweighs any other impact. So like, how do you adjust to real world, like the probability is never going to be certain scenarios?
Yeah. The answer most directly to that question is those types of arguments rarely work in BP debating. Something that is truly binary, it either happens or doesn't happen, and it has an unlikely chance of happening, but it would be really bad if it happened. Nuclear war type extensions don't happen in BP debating. Usually the version of high burden cases that's cleverer is assigning certainty to something that is improbable. What that looks like is you say, there are maybe 1 million cases, maybe our extension only applies in 2% of those cases. So you say only 2% of people engage with art in this way. Only 2% of people will react to a social movement doing that in this way. But 2% doing it will definitely do it. So you instead shrink probability in the same direction by saying that affects a smaller number of people really intensely. You say, not this is a binary, happens or doesn't happen, but maybe this thing happens less. But when it happens, certainly, then it has those consequences. But the overall point that you're making, which is that what do I mean certainty, is a fair one. Like certainty is something of a misnomer in debating. None of these things are proven. None of these things are actually certain. But usually think of what the judge needs to do to tick off the burden that you're trying to say as proven. So you say something like, here's why the God who determines whether someone gets into secular heaven believes XYZ thing. Because of this, because of this, because of this. And if you have enough of those things, if you have compelling enough reasons, compelling enough analysis of why that thing is true, it's ticked off as going from the unproven category to proven category. I'll give some more specific examples that'll hopefully help. The first of these debates is from the grand final of Oxford last year. Closing opposition on a really fun extension. The motion says that there's this omnipotent being that judges your actions based on how positive they are. And if your actions end up reaching a net positive level, they'll let you into secular heaven. And if they don't, you won't get in. And the motion physicist believes that the majority of Western citizens will not get in secular heaven. Closing opposition, which are the team from Dartmouth that eventually win Worlds like 3 months later, run a really interesting case saying, well, this omnipotent being, what makes us think that its conception of positive actions will be the same as our conception of positive action? So why would we think that morality that we ascribe to the world is the same that this omnipotent being has? Here's a bunch of reasons why actually that omnipotent being is likely to not have the same morality. For that reason, it therefore means that other teams can't really prove anything that they're saying in this debate, because actually the majority of Western citizens, we have no idea how God will adjust them. And it's actually just as probable that instead they say, well, they can be as positive as they like, as negative as they like. Maybe they like negativity, and therefore they will go to secular heaven. The problem with that case, at least in the majority of the panel's eyes, is that it presents a burden to its own case that fundamentally can't be proven, because it points out that based on how the motion operates, we can't know what the God will think with respect to positivity and human actions on net. And therefore that, sure, other teams can't get the right side of that, but the case can't be internally consistent with respect to the burden that it has on itself. So you can't say, here's why God will be one of these things or the other. And therefore it's really hard to meet the burdens that closing opposition is put under, of proving that the majority will go into secular heaven, because all they do is put an uncertainty on the rest of the debate, and therefore you sort of have to default to the earlier analysis. So that's a really interesting case that might work in the real world, but because the burden that exists there just can't be proven within the realm of the debating, it's a really hard one to win. Maybe an easier example is from my round 2 of Copenhagen EUDC. This is talking about Denmark aggressively intervening in the private sector in order to reduce dependence on Novo Nordisk. A Oxford team is in CO here, and they're a good team. They broke eventually, and they ran a case in this round that I've seen them run a few times actually, which is to say Novo Nordisk is uniquely positioned to do new innovation in general, come up with new drugs, come up with new ideas, and therefore actually make the world a better place. And their analysis up until the point of the impact is really strong. They give all of the reasons that Novo Nordisk, as a sort of pseudo-monopoly in Denmark, has unique power and ability and passion for innovation. That means that they're investing more in developing new drugs than anyone else, develop new science as opposed to everyone else. But the impact there is, by definition, kind of uncertain, because then they say, look, we don't know enough to say what those innovations might be. They weren't familiar enough with what the next Novo Nordisk groundbreaking drug was going to be. But whatever it is, it'll probably be really beneficial for society at large, because this is a big company doing big, cool pharmaceutical things. And if someone really had the scientific knowledge, we can probably make the argument that eventually, on balance, this would be a good idea. To be clear, I don't think that's inherently a terrible impact to give. Lots of times in debates like that, people will give some sort of argument of that type. Hey, if technology existed, then from the research that we did making that technology exist, there would be other benefits that maybe would mean the cross-applicability of that technology would mean that other new technologies would be good eventually. But what works with those and what doesn't work with this is some sort of gradation of impacts. So if you're going to run something that is extremely abstract in its impacts that you really can't be certain about, make sure that you have levels of impacting, that your case has other things that it does along the way. So it certainly does certain types of technological innovation, and only this big life-saving stuff might happen too. But if you have multiple levels of impacting and you achieve some certainty, judges are much more likely to buy your case eventually has other things. So you can give an example of, well, here's the kind of technology that they're about to give that they definitely will be able to follow through on if we keep their funding. And then even in the future, they might make even better technology. Having both of those bits of gradation is helpful, because you can say, here's provably how it's definitely going to happen right now, which means that these sort of speculative long-term impacts of doing good, innovative stuff in the future are likely to be better received. I'm in, and then Alex.
Yeah, this is just a comment, because I just did a quick stop. And yeah, you had Cambridge D in your CO. In my CO, it was Cambridge B. And they ran exactly the same case, like exactly the same. But they did do the impacting along the way. And it was like significantly more successful. They paid for it, and they were really good.
I like
so you know, like it works. What Cyrus is saying, basically.
Yeah, like that's helpful backup. Thank you. I knew that evidence too. Right? Okay. Go for it.
I just wanted to say this is an argument that everyone makes for why America can't publicize healthcare is that of like, oh, innovation and all of that. Yeah. So
Yeah, fair. And it's
Yeah.
like,
I feel like it's just a bad argument, but
right. It's one of those arguments that can be good situationally in the real world, and in debating, you need to frame very carefully in order for it to
it's not
seem-
good without proof. You can't get proof.
Yeah.
It's fine.
The important through line of these conforming to BP points is if you pick a case that requires the judge doing a lot of extra thinking for you and a lot of extra logic, probably arguing with a couple of the panelists who don't get it, it's just much easier for them to just say you fourth. Like if you have one of those cases that the judge in the OA says, now CO ran an interesting case. We had a difficult time placing it in the debate. The path of least resistance most of the time is to fourth you. So most of the time you end up fourthing. So just give them a path of least resistance to like third or second if you're in that kind of position. Because if you give them something where they can say, well, this bit of BP debating, this part of the judge manual means actually they don't achieve comparativeness or whatever else, you're going to be the last thing I wanted to note here was comparativeness. I won't give you a lecture on comparativeness. That's probably for another time. But let's see if this works. Yes. This one has a long info slide, so I'm going to read it.
Just real quick, whilst this person that just came in, whose name I unfortunately do not know, and I apologize. Do you want to speak or judge?
Is it okay if I do opening half though? And just have a little nice one. Thank you.
Ruby, do you want to speak or judge?
I'm not sure you do.
Okay.
Great. People have had a second to read that. The motion is just it prefers schools opting one of those models over the other. This is a good way of explaining. Why didn't that work? Nice. Nice. What I mean by comparativeness here, because comparativeness is usually built into any case. You're saying, here's why my side is better than their side. But with lots of motions that are explicitly comparing one way of doing things with another way of doing things, explaining why your way of doing things is good is the kind of pitfall case that it's easy to pick, select as a case, and often ends up losing if you aren't careful with it. So in this round, for instance, this is round 1 of Worlds. From OG, we run something about basically why textbooks and that kind of teaching is really good, useful for establishing certain things, whatever. But by selecting a case that is one side of the debate and not the other, so here's why our thing is good, you're in a really bad comparative position, as opposed to saying, into your case itself, here's where textbooks succeed and fiction books as an alternative fail. If you structure your entire case along the comparative lines, as opposed to doing two separate things at the same time, ours is good, theirs is bad, instead if you build in why the version that you're supporting is better than the exact direct parallel that opposition is supporting, and then your mechanisms all come from the comparison between the two as opposed to the support for the one, you can be in a much stronger position in debates like this. This is something that Adam Alice, for those of you who do it, RIP, was really harping on a lot. Where if you're going to say something like, I don't know, we had a debate this recently, there's going to be a big clash in the debate on whether people in a country will feel patriotic or not. It's really helpful, especially if you're going later on in the debate, to select a case that explicitly explains, here's why the reasons for not being patriotic outweigh the reasons for being patriotic. So your reasons are comparatively why the push of non-patriotism is more powerful than the push of patriotism. Or if you're talking about social movements and you're trying to decide whether radical movements or moderate movements are more likely to get media coverage, it's really easy to select a case that argues one side of that says, here are all of the reasons why extreme movements are more likely to get media coverage. It's because they're sensationalist and media organizations like sensationalism, that kind of mechanism for that kind of case. But if you can bake the comparativeness into the actual case and therefore the mechanisms of that case by saying, if you are someone in media and you're picking between the sensationalism of an extreme movement doing extreme things or platforming the rather boring but more acceptable to your viewers thing of a moderate movement, you're much more likely to pick sensationalism over appetizing the appetite of your viewers, stuff like that, appeasing them, because making your viewers mad is actually a good way to drive clicks in the future anyway, to get them coming back, to get them really angry and on your side about kind of things. So actually, as a media corporation, you probably don't care that much about whether your audience is likely to like the movement or be appeased by the movement or have the appetite for seeing that movement. You care much more about whether they're actually going to be engaged in it. So if you give a mechanism like that, that is inherently comparative to what opening opposition is likely to say on the same point about why moderate movements get more media coverage. So if you bake in that comparativeness to motions and cases specifically that are comparing A to B, it's a quite useful way to build the case. And it's really easy otherwise to just fourth because you didn't explain why the other thing couldn't do that the same. And you always lose to the response that says, well, actually, moderate movements get lots of media attention too. And then the judge is like, oh, well, it's a wash. And then you sort of move on with your life. Yeah, go for it.
This is again not related, sorry. The person that came in whose name I did not ask, even though I was definitely supposed to. What is your name? I need to know for the draw that Eli is making in another room.
NUAN.
Say again.
NUAN.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers. Sorry, Cyrus.
It's okay. It's a worse than.
Okay, I have like an actual question.
Yeah.
So okay, this is like a weird question, but I was just always wondering like what the specific kind of case falls in the debate in BP. So for example, the motion with the on the that one. So for CEO's case, if I had given the framing that they had given and then just dived into like a statistical analysis, as in why, given that there is like neutrality in terms of like we don't know what determines the morality of the omnipotent figure, then why is it far more likely that you get like maybe more amount of people that it's more likely that they don't get a net positive, and it is far more likely that they get like net negative, like statistically speaking, instead of a bunch of like not very social analysis and more numerical analysis stuff. I think it's more relevant because we tried to do that a couple of times in like politics debate because we don't really know British politics and we just start pulling probability on it. And when we're in the bin rooms, it kind of works, but we're also in the bin room, so I don't know how it falls when it comes to EP.
Yeah, I think in theory that might work. There are probably other things you can say of like, we have no idea what the God thinks in terms of moral positivity. So here are these other social factors that might make them let more people into heaven. Maybe that's like saying stuff like, because it's kind of fun and makes you feel less lonely if you people know. Like, I don't know what that analysis would actually be. Or the probabilistic things you're saying of like, here's why it's more likely to have this view of what moral positivity is. Yeah, I think it gets you somewhere and maybe breaks the deadlock. But I think because it eventually puts you in the situation where you can't prove it, you can only gesture that it's maybe more likely. Judges are just very skeptical, maybe also because they don't know as much about probability as you do in the first place. Maybe judges are just dumb and stupid and don't know your areas of knowledge as well as you would hope them to. So making the judge do as little heavy lifting for you as possible is a wise strategy that I think the probabilistic analysis suffers from and doesn't achieve otherwise. Like if you run the probabilistic analysis, you just have to hope that your judge is on the same page about how that operates and you're making them do that extra step for you. Whereas if you just run the case that is easier to understand, you're less likely to have that problem. I know that only sort of half answers your question because I don't totally know either, to be clear.
It's just on like a very desperate situation when you're just out of cases. It's usually when it comes to like voting and stuff, and then we have like very general stock arguments about how people are likely to vote, but then there's nothing beyond that. We don't know much about British politics, and then we just start yapping about probability speaking. The median would be likely to be here, whereas the elderly. And then we were in the bin room, so we were OG, so we kind of just brought the whole room into like mathematical turmoil, and I feel bad for judges. But I was just thinking, like, say we do that like slightly in more organized manner. Would that be like a thing that would work in BP as like Well, like,
Yeah.
maybe not the first case we would think of, but.
I think it goes a little bit back to the question, the answer I gave to Alex, which is if you're doing that for the probability of something happening or not happening, it's unlikely to be credited. If you're doing that for the proportion of a group that something affects, it's much more likely to be credited. So if you use that analysis for here's why, I don't know, the gifted kids that this educational program helps are actually only 2% of the kids. Most kids are average by definition. So because our case cares about the average kids, you should weigh our case higher. Like that kind of simple numerical analysis is super useful. And there you can say like, obviously by definition, the exceptionally good kids are exceptions and the average good kids are the average. There are more of ours than there. Like there, I think it's useful.
I think as well, you can like back your numbers up with like structural analysis. When it comes to like voting behavior, it'd be like, well, okay, young people are more likely to vote left wing because they're less likely to do things that indicate that you are likely to vote right wing. They're less likely to like own property or have significant like wealth. They're less likely to view conservativeness in a positive way, considering like current situation, just coming out of 40 years, arguably into year 15 of conservative governance. Just historically, they're more likely to be left wing. They're more likely to be in education systems that are going to, in some way, reinforce like left wing values because the education system is broadly left wing because they care about human beings. Who said that? And then, like, if you put that structural analysis and then you do a bunch of cool numbers, you've like tickled the itch in the judge's brain of the structural analysis, and then you've really bamboozled them by being super smart with numbers, and then they're like, well, this person must be correct because they did the structural analysis and they gave some numbers, and I've written down some numbers. Well, fantastic. Okay, not a fourth, which is like what we're going for.
I would you have anything to add?
Yeah, actually, so like I obviously agree you should try and look for burdens that are provable. I think often this advice is given to people very randomly and then they overcorrect. So then they start like not proving burdens that maybe they could have actually shot for, and they start like wasting time proving really uncontroversial burdens. So what's your advice going to prep time in case selection in ensuring that you're hitting the correct burdens and also just not wasting time on burdens that will be uncontroversial in the debate? Unless you're going to go on to that. But
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably it's worth thinking. The two parties that will contest whether a burden is worth proving or not are the judge. The judge will say, this burden I intuitively know, therefore I don't care. That thing I think happens like kind of rarely. Usually I wouldn't rely on that. And the second is, will the opposition actually contest this thing or not? Like, would a sane whip say, well, they didn't prove this burden and therefore their case can't work? If a sane whip wouldn't contest it because it's so self-evidently true that there's no other way of interpreting it, then probably it's not worth giving the burden. Otherwise, yeah. Hello. 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Oh. Yeah, 7 o'clock. Yeah, Alice.
Okay, so if we are going into case planning and we're running into something, sorry, like we were talking about voting, where it's like there are two burdens that are that each different side would want to prove that are like both like kind of true in that people vote for their own interests, like we're keeping on the voting train, people vote for their own interests, but then there's also the opposite that the other side would be likely to bring up in that like people vote against their own interests all the time. Like, how do you try to like avoid that? What do you do in like a sort of debate like that where you can have opposites that can both kind of be true?
Well, in that case, you would need to say why your thing is more true than their thing. So for instance, if you were saying people vote against their interests, why do they vote against their interests? Mostly because they don't know that those are their interests. If they knew that those things, policies would be bad for them, then clearly they wouldn't be voting for them. So then you say, such is the nature of misinformation in this political issue in this country, that actually what's in people's interests doesn't matter often because it can very easily be weaponized. And then you give an example. You say, here's the rhetoric that is easily weaponized against people who actually this policy is bad for to make them think that policy is good for them by instilling fear over, I don't know, this being a slippery slope towards other social issues or other kinds of things like that. You just need to explain why, if people are voting against their interests, what is making them do that? And then vice versa, if people are voting in their interests, that's the kind of burden that maybe comes up, maybe doesn't. It depends on which issue they're voting against or for their interest in. So that way, like using the heuristic of would a reasonable opposition challenge me on this claim? Do that. Yeah.
So you need to make it more of a mechanization debate as opposed to like a general framing ideal.
Yeah.
kind of-
Yeah. If you try to argue broadly about what people
Yeah.
will vote for the things that are good for them or bad for them, like it'll sort of devolve very quickly. The thing I would say too is, if you prove a burden you didn't need to prove, you wasted like 25 seconds of your speech. If you don't prove a burden that you did need to prove, you probably lose. So basically, I'm giving you guys all a very conservative, risk-averse approach to debating, but alas. The case that wins, I only have one slide on this because I think case collection only gets you so far, and frankly, what do I know? Actually, first, I have any more debates than anyone else. But here are some thoughts on picking the case of many that is more likely to eventually win. The first thing is proactively thinking about the weighing of the case, particularly in the case of, in extension, having two cases. Very often in opposition, there are like two obvious reasons not like a policy, because the policy is bad and because you get backlash for the policy. So when you're thinking of the case, think of which one your second speaker would rather weigh. So say, here's how to present this case such that the backlash case easily weighs against the policy bad case, or vice versa, and then make the decision on which one you select, partially based on which one is easier to weigh, and then also do it in reverse, as in based on what the way to weigh the case is, present it in a way that feeds into that. So if you're going to end up weighing this on likelihood and certainty, make sure that you really hammer down on those base level small impacts that are definitely going to happen, like talking a lot about catharsis and all this sort of dumb debate stuff like that. So thinking about weighing in prep time is a useful thing for case selection. Can this case be weighed? Otherwise, it's really easy in debates when you haven't identified other teams' cases and also how you're going to weigh against them to misread the debate and think that a narrative debate is going to have big, massive consequences when actually it has small ones, or vice versa. I remember experiences where from OG I proved something, I did a really good job proving the thing, and it's like that underrepresented voters will turn out to vote 20% more often because they think that power doesn't corrupt absolutely. And then actually ends up meaning that because the other cases in that round, which I could have thought of at the time, are of much more significant things, like getting representation in positions of power and stuff like that, I can do well enough to third, but that case is never winning because I've already acknowledged that the level of impact it achieves is likely to be small. There's no way to weigh it against the other cases in the debate. The other two things here are really just one, which is whether it feels like a case that is the kind of case that wins the argument. Basically, what you're just trying to do is convince the judge that you're right on this thing. So having a case that is proven and works and maybe is really clever and maybe is a new way of thinking about something is much less important than having the case that can easily feel like a winner. Like when you're hearing the case, the rhetoric of it is really powerful in just feeling like the reason that you decide that issue, that it's good at making other things in the debate feel small in comparison to, I don't know, the big harm that you're giving. And that can be on like an active weighing basis. You just have a bigger impact than other teams, but also it can be on a smaller level. I'll give an example. In the motion about at Euros of this house supports the narrative that doctors know best, the case that quite clearly beat ours and our round from extension was just saying doctors don't know best because actually we should just let our patients choose. It's important for patients to make decisions, sometimes make the decisions wrong, but like you just gotta make them actually make the choices because they make good choices and then they feel empowered and all that kind of stuff. And that case was helpful because the other bits of this narrative debate delve into particulars really fast. It talks about whether doctors know best on this thing or this thing, how the narrative is interpreted by lots of people, whether it applies in situations of vaccines or whether vaccines are out of the debate, whether in general doctors are sexist or not, all those other kind of things. And you can make good arguments for all those things that are compelling, but going to the core of the issue with a case when you're given the opportunity, especially in closing, usually is helpful. The last thing I have here is just on enjoying it. This is something that Iman preaches a lot. Oftentimes you think you get too caught up in whatever, all the rest of the things that I've been saying now, which is, well, this case is probably the best case. Oh, I probably should run backlash here because I'm sure that there's a backlash case that wins this round. And I don't know, I saw some Euros winners do it last round, whatever else. But the competitive advantage that you have in debating is on the cases that you know the most about and that you like the best. So the cases that you enjoy, you tend to enjoy because you like the way they operate and because you understand them much better than other cases. So if you default to the case that you're sure you can do well and you'll enjoy giving, that will bleed into all of the other bits of the case that are relevant. So you'll be better at responding to silly, flippant rebuttals of that case. You'll be more likely to have compelling rhetorical bits of analysis that make your case more believable. You'll be more able to come up with examples for that case. So if you pick a case that you know and enjoy, you're going to be in a better spot. So just even if you find that a little risky, you can just go for that as long as it meets the other criteria of not losing. Like it. Any questions here? Perfect. We'll skip this practice for now if we're gonna have to run right into it, and otherwise we can come back to it. This is lastly, just one last slide on this, from before and then from after of the actual case itself. Antebellum, before the debate, some things to think about. The first speaker is always right in matters of case selection. This I mean really seriously, even though I'm just a first speaker. If you're having discussions over which case to run and there are arguments about it, you just go with what the first speaker wants. Because if you go with the second speaker's case, the first speaker doesn't feel confident on or doesn't want to give, then they give it in a way that the second speaker wasn't expecting to give it. There's a mismatched understanding of how it's going to get run. And eventually the second speaker is like trying to redo the case while also running a bunch of other things. Even if you're really confident that you have the better case, if your first speaker decides that they want to run a different extension, I'd give them the full authority to do that. And I say this, even though in both of my majors partnerships, like for the most part, the person making the decisions was Tom or was Eli. So I was making like few decisions. I was clearly not the alpha of the partnership in either case. But on matters of picking this case specifically, just let your first speaker do it. Otherwise, like, it's just not worth an argument. This is the multiple labeled extension things I was talking about earlier. In prep, when you're in back half, have two extensions that you have a sort of 2-word, 3-word code word for. And a basic thesis statement for. So either we're going to run the backlash case or we're going to run the principle on blank. And then you can whisper to your partner after the first first speeches being like, here's the case we're running. Just have them already labeled in your head and then you can start writing them out. But just have at least 2 options on extension so that the problem we were talking about earlier of running an extension that doesn't work because it either becomes derivative or because it doesn't work in the context of something earlier doesn't happen nearly as often. Lastly is in prep time, go between the ideas, mechanisms, and cases. Don't do them one at a time. So you come up with a bunch of mechanisms and then they form into a case. Or maybe you have a broad idea and then you think of mechanisms for it. Flip back and forth between those 3 things quite often. How would this mechanism work in a different case so that the title of the case keeps evolving based on the new bits of analysis that you want to skip into it? Don't just say, here are the mechanisms, I'm going to make that into a case. Don't just say, here's the case, let me now find all the mechanisms. You want to go back and forth so you have the most holistic approach. After the debate, it's really easy, and I think the default after the debate when you're getting feedback from a judge is asking for feedback on your case. So you go and you ask, what could I have done to make this case win? What was wrong with this burden? What bit of analysis would I need to make this part of the extension work? And because you've thought about your case for an hour and then debated it for another 20 minutes, you've often developed a sort of attachment to your case, like it's kind of your baby in some ways. So if it loses, even if it wins, like you kind of want to keep doing and seeing what you could have done even better on that case. It's also worth asking though, well, what extension would have won this round to get an idea of the other cases you would have given? Or if you've done this and you've labeled multiple extensions and then you picked one of them over the other one, say, we were also considering running this extension. What would you think about that? Would that have been better? Asking your judge that right away is helpful because otherwise you can get tunnel vision into just trying to improve the same cases you always run. Yeah.
Sorry, just to add on to that, because sometimes I have asked judges for alternative cases after I both, and they're like, sorry, it's just a poo juice motion and there's nothing you could have done. So in those cases, like seriously, and they're not the CA, and like so sometimes also judges aren't geniuses, right? So like they don't know what they would have run, but they know what the problem was that made you not win. The second question I'd like to ask after this is, what could I have clashed on that we were like underdeveloped on? Like what could we have contested from like the other side, for example, that maybe we could have flipped, or like maybe we could have taken a shot at that you think we just left too untouched? And often I have an answer to that.
Yeah. The other answer to that question helpfully segues into the last point, which is utilize the union. We now have lots of good, successful first speakers specifically. That's what I'm thinking about, because I think case selection also ends up being about sort of matter and content generation, that kind of thing. On the first issue of ideas, you have no idea what extension you could have run in a debate. Ask Werdon. Werdon is like just a complete, like his brain works in a way unlike anyone else I've ever met. So if you think that there wasn't an extension in a round, Werdon has thought of like 7 extensions from your exact position. I so often these days, I'm like, what are other ideas for this? And then you try to work them in. Like there are more applications than anyone else can think of. In terms of burdens, you like roughly have an idea, but you're not quite sure what the burdens of it would have been if you were to run it, and the judges being helpful. Contact Josh. Josh like always has like 6 burdens and has them written out really explicitly for every single thing. He's really good at identifying what the thing is. If you want the mechanisms, then you go to Iman, because Iman can come up with like mechanisms both out of his brain and out of his ass, and both of those are useful. And we'll think of like more ways to prove the thing than you've thought of. And then if you want to put all of those things together, this is where I put myself in that category, because I don't think I fit into any of the other 3. Ask. I think we have lots of people who care about debating, and we all ask each other questions about these things all the time. So genuinely, if you're in a position in a spar or like in a round or at a tournament and you're like, I don't know what to do about this case, I don't know what I should have run from this position, or you have any questions about those 4 sub points, just shoot one of us a Facebook message. I'm volunteering all of them. They haven't agreed to this, but you should just do that. They appreciate it. And then they can give you those ideas, because it's much easier when you put it to the group link. But yeah. Any questions on this or the rest of the workshop? Lovely. I don't know quite what the schedule is now. If Eli is running the rounds now, we can go straight into that. Otherwise, I can send you guys on a little exercise, and then I will dip for it. But, yeah.
Straight onto the right.
Like it. Fun. Let me test that. Yeah. First month of